Just starting out as self-employed and wondering whether you should be paying some tax? Well, let me tell you about the trading allowance. As a business accountant, my team and I spend all day long helping business owners on their journey. And I think when you're just starting out on that journey, knowing whether you should be paying tax or how you pay it and all these types of questions is a big stress and something a lot of people worry about. Obviously, there's a lot of videos on this channel telling you about how to go around getting a tax return and all those kind of things. But I wanted to talk today about the trading allowance because that does take a lot of stress away for a lot of people. Now, back in around 2017, the government came out and said, look, we're going to introduce this amazing new thing called a trading allowance. And it's going to mean that you don't have to pay us any tax on the first £1,000 of your self-employed income. So if you started up like a side hustle, as they're known, something alongside your main job, that was quite cool because it meant that you didn't have to do a tax return and you didn't have to pay any tax. Now, I think for a lot of people, and I'm sure everybody knows somebody who was selling maybe Avon, candles, Herbalife, all these kind of things that are very regular in this kind of world, probably weren't declaring it anyway because they didn't understand what they were meant to do. So in a way, it was quite a great political thing to announce. Yep, we're allowing you to do this. I think a lot of people were anyway, but it is a really great thing to be able to do. It does cut down massively the admin burden if you, for example, are just sort of putting your toe out there and want to try it without too much hassle involved. So it's a really cool thing and I'm going to tell you all about it right now. But before we dive into it, make sure if you do like these type of videos to click the subscribe button below and you'll be notified whenever we release more just like it. So the trading allowance, as I mentioned, allows you to earn less than £1,000 without having to do a tax return and without having to pay any tax. Now, there might be some reasons where you do actually earn under £1,000 and you might still want to register for a tax return. So for example, things like that, there are different considerations and it does depend on your exact circumstances, but there are instances where you might want to, the main one being register a loss. So if you actually spent more money than you've had in, then there's a good reason to do a tax return, especially if you're employed, because you can do things like use that loss against some tax you might pay in your main job to get some money back, or you can bring that loss forward and then pay less tax later on. So if you're making a reasonable loss, it's definitely worth doing the tax return for that purpose alone. And then there's some other reasons that you might think about it, like for example, state pension, maternity allowance, national insurance contributions. There's a wide range of things where sometimes it's a good idea anyway. Through coronavirus, being able to prove you were self-employed is quite important. And sometimes for other reasons, you might want to prove that you were self-employed. The tax return will help you do that because it's all declared on there. Now, so if you want to do that, or you earn over £1,000, then you need to go and get yourself a tax return. There's another video on the channel for that. I'm sure if we've been clever, we'll link it up here for you so you can go straight to it and then you go and get your tax return. Now we're talking a minute about how you can still use the trading allowance even when you've got to do that. But for now, just understand that if your ins, so you added up all your money and it was less than £1,000, you don't actually have to do a tax return and you don't have to pay any tax on that. So those things out of the way, let's get into the fact of, okay, so we've gone over £1,000. Let's talk about how to do the tax return and where the trading allowance comes into it. So there's some boxes on the tax return to sort of declare this and claim this, but effectively what happens is, let's say you took £1,700 in, you've got two options. One, you can deduct the flat £1,000 trading allowance straight off it. So if you had £1,700, you're going to deduct your £1,000 trading allowance and you've got £700 now of profits. Brilliant, done, no extra things required. And in fact, if your expenses were less than £1,000, you're winning, aren't you? Because you've been able to say, look, I'm using this £1,000 is higher than say my £300 of real expenses, and that's completely fine, and that's within the law. And I think that's a great benefit of this if you're just starting out. So that's one thing to do. The other thing to do is actually calculate it in the normal way. So under the normal rules, you would keep business accounts in terms of maybe a spreadsheet. I mean, there's other videos on this, but let's just say it was a simple spreadsheet because you're really just starting out and you've got all your ins in a column and all your tax deductible outs in the other. Now, you'd put those two figures into the boxes on the tax return and it would calculate your real profits. So let's say in this example, you had £1,700 in and you only really had £300 worth of expenses. Obviously, you're going to pay tax on £1,400. Where in the other example, you've only paid tax using the allowance of £700. So in this case, it makes sense to claim the allowance. Now, there's a couple of reasons where you want to be a bit careful with this. Let's say you've actually already got a big self-employment, you're a self-employed graphic designer and you're earning 20 or 25 odd grand a year, say, and then you start selling candles on the side. You might think, oh great, I'll use that trading allowance in my candle business. But it's kind of an all or nothing in the self-employed world. So if you say you're going to use that allowance, it applies to all of your self-employed income. So you might not want to do that because your graphic designer expenses might be vastly more than £1,000. So just bear that in mind. It's a small little trap to do. And as I say, the other one that springs to mind immediately is if you're just starting a business out, You might have what they call pre-trade expenditure, which means money you spent before you started to get going. Now, that's a complicated area in itself. I think people do get that one wrong, but let's just say you've got a fair amount of stuff there. Under this trading expenditure allowance, you're not necessarily going to be able to claim those. So there's a couple of reasons why it's worth considering. But just on the absolute basic situation, let's just say you've started a Herbalife business or something like that, then this trading allowance is really good for just deducting the money straight off. But for me, I think the main thing is that it's knowing whether you need to create a loss or not. That's the biggest decision a lot of the time, because early doors, deducting a straight £1,000 is probably going to be beneficial for you in a lot of cases than actually your real expenditure. But I think if you've got more expenditure, because it's quite there's a lot of setup costs and all that kind of stuff, then having a look at using the normal rules is probably going to help you out more because of that tax loss situation. And I suppose a couple of other final caveats on this. If you're in a partnership, so there's various different ways of setting up your business in terms of self-employment, partnership, limited companies, all these things. But if you're a partnership, you can't currently use the rules. The other thing to note is that if you've got some property income, it was called a trading and property allowance. So there was a couple of things going on. This is separate as well to the property one. So you get £1,000 to play with here. And if you've got a very small property interest, you've also got £1,000 there. It's probably in the scope of another video, but just so you know, it is there. So that is the key highlights of the trading allowance. So do use it. I think in the right situations, it's fantastic and stops you from the admin burden of having a tax return. But do think about that. Am I getting a loss? Is there anything else that I need a tax return for? That's it. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you got value from this, please do share, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.